Hi, Margaret. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks for everyone joining us today online. We are the Institute of Business Ethics, and we're here today joined by Margaret Heffernan to talk about ethical leadership, ethics and imagination, and why Margaret's new book, Embracing Uncertainty, has so much to offer business ethics practitioners and those wishing to lead ethically. We'll be exploring the book and looking at the relationship between uncertainty, imagination, and ethics, and why learning to really embrace uncertainty is a muscle you can build and a skill and one that helps you to lead better. First, I want to start by welcoming our supporters who are joining us today as a non-profit. None of our work would be possible without your support, and welcome also to everyone else we have joining us today from a wide range of companies, consultancies, institutions and regulators across many countries. Welcome. At the IBE, we're focused on ethical leadership, culture and values-based decision-making. We provide networks and convenings, research and insights, education and ethical leadership development programs for leaders wanting to lead ethically and better. So, welcome, Margaret. Margaret, you are a well-known, you are a well-known author, commentator, entrepreneur. You're a professor of practice at the University of Bath and a mentor to CEOs and senior executives in business, and have just released your new book, Embracing Uncertainty: How Writers, Musicians and Artists Thrive in an Unpredictable World. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on.
I often say that if compliance is about the rules, then ethics is about imagination. And why I wanted to have a conversation about your book is that becoming comfortable with uncertainty by not freezing in the face of it, I think, those moments where we imagine that we don't know the answer, that we can get better at values-based decision-making and action, and we can become more effective and better at ethical leadership. And so before we get into that, I'd really like to start by talking about the book. Could you just, for everybody listening and watching us today, just explain a little bit about what was the inspiration for the book? What made you want to write the book at this moment in time?
It's a good question. It was a number of things. Partly it was recognizing that a lot of people that I work with, primarily, but not only in business, felt paralyzed by uncertainty. They really felt that they couldn't make a move or take a decision until they had all the information in. And I remember, watching them doing this, thinking, well, this is mad. You should at least be exploring, coming up with options, coming up with plans B, C, D, and E. This is an opportunity, this uncertainty, to try some things and develop your capacity. The classic example of this, I think, is, well, we're going to wait to see what happens with AI, and then we'll fire everybody, and replace them with technology. And thinking, no, everything about this is wrong. You can't just wait. You need to understand what AI is. You need to start having some very sophisticated and very thoughtful and unrushed discussions about where it might or might be useful, what the trade-offs are, what the social costs and implications are, how far you can upskill the people you have who already understand your business, which is the crucial thing. So this is, while the world is trying to figure out and the technology is stabilizing, one hopes, this is an opportunity to learn, get in there and mess around. And I saw this sort of polarization between, right, we've just taken it on board and fired thousands of people, and then discovered, oh, wow, that didn't work so well because customers really hate it. Between the sort of over lust for action and the paralysis, there was a huge opportunity which nobody really knew how to deal with creatively. The other thing was, the sort of foundational data point of my previous book was the degree to which, if you really are one of the best forecasters in the world, which by definition many aren't, then the furthest out you can see with any degree of reliable accuracy is now about 400 days. If you're a normal human being, it's closer to 150 days. So if you then take that and say, okay, so we just basically don't know the future, then that's an opportunity to think about, well, what would I like it to be and how could I move towards that? Because while things are unsettled, there is an opportunity before all the doors are closed, so to speak. And then again, I guess the really foundational kind of experience was standing on a railway platform. This is how the book starts, basically. And hearing this announcement that said, the train to London Paddington will arrive in 2 minutes. And it felt so certain. And my mind went into this sort of funny thought experiment in which actually it could go on, this voice, and say, and you will sit down in coach seat 37 and you will order a cup of tea from the trolley and you will read 7 pages of your book and then you'll do email. And it went on and on and on like this in my head until the very last day of my life and the time and reason for my death. I thought, well, that's certainty for you. And it's pretty appealing. If we have total certainty, which I heard lots of people around me saying, oh, if only we knew what the future held, then we would have no choices. The life wouldn't really feel like our own. It would just feel like an automatically generated to-do list, which we went through life crossing off obediently. And that sounded pretty horrible. And I do know a couple of people who I think that kind of is their attitude to life. If I can just get through everything. And I thought, well, this is a failure to live, never mind a failure to thrive. So we should be really careful of what we ask for when we ask for certainty, because we probably won't like it at all. And then a conversation with a fantastic psychologist in Germany, Gert Gegerenzer, who said, there's lots of things about uncertainty people love. They don't want to know what they're getting for their birthday. They don't want to know what gender their baby will be. Almost nobody wants to know the day on which they're going to die. And nobody goes to a football match excited because they know what the score is going to be. So let's reframe uncertainty as opportunity and think that the moments, spaces of uncertainty are where we can make an impact, where we have choices, we have options, and we can invent.
Brilliant. And I think that's what comes across as you, and I listened to the book, and when I was listening to the book, what came across was really this idea that, not just that we should kind of observe whether we are in a space of certainty or uncertainty, but actually when you really start to become comfortable with uncertainty, how soothing it is or how relaxing it is, and how it then becomes, you can adapt to it better and start to see the possibilities in that space, as opposed to this idea, this kind of craving of certainty and clinging to facts, when actually that's a false reality. It isn't what's really going on in the world at the moment, and so it isn't as helpful as we might think it to be. So interesting. I loved listening to the book. It's beautifully put together, the audiobook, with musical interludes. It's a really it's a creative piece of work in itself. And the interlude on RADA I thought was very interesting. We have our ethics framework and we talk about at the IBE the importance of governance and oversight in approaching ethics at an organizational level. And how you talked about RADA was very interesting. And this question for you is, in relation to uncertainty, do you think that, in your opinion or experience, boards are perhaps not natural places for uncertainty?
Well, I think that, first of all, I just go back on something you'd say. I think facts really do matter. But what I would say is facts are always about the past. So they don't necessarily tell you anything about the future, which an uncertainty is mostly, but not exclusively, is the future. as far as boards are concerned, I think that they're very often driven too furiously for consensus. There's a failure to understand that disagreement is how groups think together. And as long as it's done in the right spirit, it's profoundly and critically productive. One of the things that was really interesting about the Nevada board is I think it's constitutionally required to be made up half and half, people of the theater and the other, others. I was there as an other, right? Alan Rickman, who invited me to join, was obviously there as an artist and as a rather graduate. And one of the things that I started to realize was that these two groups of people are quite anxious around each other. The non-artists are intimidated by the actors, who they think of as rather delicate flowers who can't really handle reality very well. And the business people also afraid of coming across as too crass or hard-hearted or pragmatic. So this was a sort of a mutual misunderstanding. The actors were often quite humble in terms of their understanding of the board. So a lot of it was genuinely theater in the sense that what we saw was not real. And in fact, we subsequently discovered we had a senior leadership team that was pretty much putting on theater for our behalf. But the thing that struck me most was the failure of rich, valuable interaction, but also that ultimately what broke this logjam were the actors saying, hang on a second, it looks like this is what's going on. Why aren't we talking about that? And they, of course, understood that conflict is where everything happens. That's what drama is all about. And you're not going to make any progress unless you get it on the table where you can talk about it and argue about it. And I just thought it was very interesting on many levels that the failure to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and the dominance of stereotypes, which happens easily and often on boards, hugely degraded the quality of conversation that we could have. And after finally this logjam was broken, we continued to do some really, really good, productive stuff that had been necessary, I would have to say, for years. And, the organization was salvaged, but it had been in a very, very difficult position. The other thing I'd say is I will never understand, but at my second board meeting, I just had an instinct that something horrible was going on. And I reached out to some of the actors on the board who just watched, were very good at sort of sensing what's going on here. And we just watched for a while until we started to exert some pressure and to start questioning in areas we thought might be oversensitive.
So interesting. Yeah, the power of observation, the importance of the quality of the conversation, and conflict being such a valuable tool for processing and understanding and growing and learning. In our work, we talk a lot at the Institute about the importance of speaking up and encouraging a culture within work where you can, the employees or people in work feel free to speak up, are encouraged to do so. And we see the benefits of doing that all the way through to innovation and the performance of the organization improving if it has an ethical culture. Can you talk a little bit about the courage of artists, to speak up or to create something when they don't know, what the consequences might be, or in the face of not knowing, and what are the learnings there potentially for trying to encourage speak up within cultures?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I think the one thing all artists have in common is that they know that if they don't do something or say something, then nothing happens. And artists have a great sense of agency, a great desire to make things happen, whether it's a painting or a piece of music or a book or a poem or whatever. So they don't lack initiative and they don't wait to be asked. They're very, very self-motivated, which is a tremendous resource in any kind of organization. I think the issue around speaking up has become very clogged. First of all, we have this concept of psychological safety, which seems to cover everything from well-being to sleep to the sort of language that one uses around the boardroom or in management and so on and so forth. I think I understand the fundamental notion, which I think is profound, which is if I say something appropriate with goodwill, that should be received as a contribution. Bosses should not just slap their people down because that will silence them pretty much for good. I understand that there is a phenomenon known in academic circles as organizational silence, where if you ask a whole host of people in a workplace, do you have issues and concerns that you do not voice? The vast majority will say yes. That is the problem. We have to understand that there are also working conditions that will prohibit people from ever feeling safe. If I work in a gig economy job, I don't feel safe. I can be fired in a moment. The preponderance of businesses that now hire people on a year or 2-year contract, they don't feel safe. Almost every young person I talk to now, you know what they want? They want a secure job. If you want them to feel safe, give them a secure job and then manage them well. But the precarity of work significantly militates against safety. However, if you manage to achieve employment conditions in which people have good reason to feel safe, then the issue is to try to avoid a culture of perfectionism where people feel, well, I can't say anything until it is perfectly formed. And I think we've all been in these situations where you think, I want my question to be perfect. Well, there are two problems with that. One is while you're thinking of your perfectly crafted question, often the conversation moves on. And the second is it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to ask a question. I know people often feel, that when I said something isn't quite right, I have only two options. One is stand on the tabletop and scream about it. And the other one is be silent about it. And what speaking up is about is exploring the huge spectrum between those two extremes. So if there's something you don't understand, you don't have to say it's good or bad. You can say, I'm very sorry, I don't quite understand what we mean by this, or I don't quite understand why we're doing this, or how it turned out that way, or whatever. These are very, very neutral interventions, but they are worth their weight in gold. I taught a whole class last week on how to ask good questions, because they're a softer kind of intervention. I think the other thing is, and again, this is something that artists really understand, which is that when you throw in an idea, like, well, maybe it would be better if such and such, what you're doing is you're taking whatever idea is in play and you're offering something that you think could make it better. I think that's the fundamental mindset that should drive the intervention. It would be better if. Maybe it would be safer if. Maybe it would be quicker too. It doesn't have to be a scream. And it usually is only a scream because somebody's been suppressing it for a very long period of time. It's interesting. I'm preparing for a conference next week, and I was going through some material on this, and I came across a quote, which is in my own book, but from John Brown, the former chief executive of BP, who at a time when BP had a very much higher than average fatality rate in an industry that has a high fatality rate. And he said, I really wish more people had disagreed with me. Well, I think that's a really, I suspect, a very honest thing to say. But what he doesn't do is think, well, what was he doing not to encourage people to do that? And the reality about John Brown's leadership is he hired people almost identical to himself, often from the same university with a degree in the same subject, many of whom looked like him, acted like him, and yes, were primarily men. But he also was very well known, and whether this is true or not, in some way doesn't matter. It was understood across BP that he wasn't interested in safety. Safety isn't sexy, is what everybody quoted to me. So guess what? Nobody taught about safety. So leaders have to be very, very, very conscious of the tone they set and the reputation they get. I know other CEOs that, so-and-so doesn't like a meeting to overrun half an hour. Well, if that's the case, and the person really does believe that, there are many, many decisions can't be made in half an hour, but it's unlikely actually to be true. It's worth inquiring and then thinking, well, is this the best way to make decisions? But you have to be very aware of what are the assumptions people have about you. And you have to be aware that if you have power, people are trying to please you. So you have got to, as a fundamental part of your job, encourage debate, dissent, suggestions, and so on. And I've even when I was still running businesses, I've specifically asked people to listen for all the reasons we shouldn't do X. What information might change the decision? How much of this decision do we have to make today? Who gets hurt? This is my favorite question. Every decision, almost every decision, somebody gets hurt. So let's have it out on the table and see who and why and can we remediate it. Sometimes the answer is going to be no, but let us at least know the cost of a choice that we're making. And very frequently, if you don't specifically request that, nobody's going to raise it.
And there's so much in there, and it's so interesting. I love that you started the answer in regards to Speak Up, looking at this from not just an individual level, but also an organizational level, and there's obviously also the systemic level, that people are looking first and foremost for what the job is providing them from a job security perspective, and do they feel safe at an organizational level? And then you can build the skills to develop their ability to embrace uncertainty and speak up in the face of not knowing or feeling uncomfortable or witnessing misconduct. And I think that's such an important starting point for people thinking about how to lead organizations ethically. And then I think that idea and the importance of observation and asking good questions really reminds me of Mary Gentile's work, which I know you have been involved in for many years, about giving voice to values, and that so much I think I see in ethics is people thinking about ethical dilemmas and coming to the decision, but actually it's that ability, that skill to kind of go past that and say, okay, and how are we going to influence this, or how are we going to turn this decision into action, this values-based decision into action? And what really struck me listening to your book was around how artists are so good at that and see that as a discipline, and that it's a skill that they develop. And I kind of wonder, coming into the call, what would you say to ethics practitioners, when they're thinking about how they're trying to lead ethics within organizations, they're trying to kind of, build an organization's capability to embrace uncertainty. What comes to you when I talk about that?
I think a couple of things. I was teaching Giving Voice to Values last week, so it's very top of mind. One of the key concepts in Mary's work is the notion of rehearsing the discussion that you want to have. And this is primarily an imaginative action. So if I think, okay, I need to go and talk to so-and-so about how, the worries I have about a particular decision. I really need to be able to write the script. If I say X, the other person is going to respond how. If I say Y, how are they going to respond? If it's two of us having the conversation, three of us having a conversation instead of one of us, what's going to be different? What's really going to matter to the person that I need to influence and why? What values might we have in common that I can use to recruit this person to my perspective? What is their perspective? Everything I have just said is how novelists think about writing their characters. So it is a fundamentally imaginative act, being able to see somebody else who isn't you and see what the dilemma looks like from their perspective, to move beyond good and bad, right and wrong, and think about if this is a fine professional colleague, and I think I'm a fine professional colleague, and we disagree, is that a sign that there's a better way to do it, and can we figure this out together? And one of the joys of teaching giving voice to values is I do a lot of role plays with my MBA students, and it never ceases to amaze me how many different ways there are, in fact, to resolve these real life case studies. But it takes preparation and rehearsal, and it takes fantastic listening to other people to understand indeed what their values are. Why are they in this company? Why are they in that job? What do you know about them? And if you don't know very much about them, how are you going to find out? Because you have to approach them not just as the holder of a job title, but also as a human being. Because to the degree that you talk to their congruent values, you have a far greater chance of getting their support and opening up a wider variety of options. And in my experience, discussions about ethics frequently stumble at the first jump because they're turned into binaries. Are we going to do this or not? Are we going to fire him or not? I now have a knee-jerk reaction. The minute anyone presents me with a binary, I think, okay, what's the third one? There's got to be a third one. Don't tell me there's not a third one. There isn't a third one. Go back and think again. Because
so
it's
important.
Thinking, it's divisive thinking. And if you work at it, you'll find it. Now, I'm not saying that third option is the best option. Usually when you find one, you start finding a lot. But dig into it, dig deeper where it really matters. I mean, I'm not saying, well, between coffee and tea, there must be hot chocolate. But, on the stuff that really matters, or the stuff you feel really uncomfortable with, my first question would be, is it being presented as a binary? If so, that's a problem. Find the spaces between them.
Wow, such a rich answer, and so much in there. And it really does remind me of the importance of ethical leadership development programs that don't just give you the sort of technical skills, but develop those core competencies for you to be much more aware of the limitations of what you know and don't know, and the assumptions you're making. Are you being genuinely open-minded? And also then the skills you need to have the conversations you need to explore that with others in a way that is constructive and positive and builds to a better place. I've worked with so many organizations in the past who have had hugely successful businesses, global businesses, but perhaps their business model is stuck, and they need to innovate. And they look to strategy and not to culture for the answers there. And I think, what your book is doing so brilliantly is just just constant, you know, the way that you've grounded just in creativity and the creative process talks so much to what could be so valuable to organizations like that are potentially stuck in strategy, frankly, and the skills needed to navigate ethical complexity. That's fantastic. The one of the questions that's coming in, I know we're getting questions through the Q&A, and I must reflect some of those. So one from David Gross: do you think that management especially struggle with domains that are complex systems with their interrelationships, non-linearity, emergent properties, etc., e.g. organizational cultures, when compared with more linear systems, e.g. new products, new technology? If too many people come from a STEM, accountancy, law background, they inappropriately but unwittingly try to apply linear solutions to complex problems, do you think?
I think fundamentally, if I understand the question correctly, I think the short answer to that is yes. I think so many of our organizations these days are very complex, and the disciplines that have to interoperate are complex. And each discipline has its own language and ways of thinking, which very often are very hard for other people to understand. I was just thinking as I was listening to the question of a fabulous CEO I knew when I was running tech companies in the US, a woman named Carol Valone. And she had a process which I thought was absolutely bloody brilliant. When they came to do their annual budget for the year, obviously every department head would do their budget. And then they'd have to swap budgets. And so the head of marketing would have to explain the chief technology officer's proposed budget. And the chief technology officer would have to explain the people budget and so on. In other words, it was a phenomenal exercise in perspective taking, but it also taught everybody how, well, if I'm the CTO, I can't function if HR doesn't have the money that it needs to recruit the people that I'm going to be looking for. And if marketing doesn't have its budget, we don't have enough revenue to do the cool technology we want to do. And it is a very brilliant, simple, relatively simple way to get out of that linear, deeply siloed mindscape and start to see that actually none of us around this table can succeed if the others don't. So now it has to be not who can shout the loudest, but who can come up with the most creative trade-offs. And I mean, I've never come across anyone else doing that. And I think it's a brilliant way when putting the annual plan or the 3-year plan or whatever together so that people truly understand that it's not just about them. And ethics fundamentally is always about other people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So true. We have a lot of professional bodies who are supporters, and, you know, we're doing more work in looking at the ethics of, you know, professional ethics. We provide training, leadership development, to supporters on that. And I think that getting comfortable with saying, I don't know, when you're a professional feels sometimes counterintuitive, doesn't it? It's kind of, it goes against everything that you're coming as an expert, you're potentially being paid by the hour to make things more efficient, more effective, to support, you know, speed of delivery and execution. And so that whole piece of, being a professional and being ethical can kind of go against each other. And I think that's where you talk about the discipline or the space that needs to be created to ask these kinds of questions is particularly hard if your business model is kind of charging by the hour, for example. But artists are so far away from, you know, so far away from that, and yet they are also, your book highlights so brilliantly, grounded in things like discipline. And I wondered if you could just talk about that, because it feels a little bit at odds, that idea that you create a beautiful painting, but actually the work that goes into it is quite structured and quite disciplined.
Yeah, I think, as someone who sometimes charges by the hour for work that I do, I understand the dilemma. When I started doing this kind of work, I don't generally do consulting, but I will do some mentoring of chief executives, and I will occasionally do some strategy work. I guess there are a couple of things that are clear in my head. One is I need not to be dependent on a single client. If you're dependent on a single client, your ethical hazard is very much greater. And the poster child for that is Arthur Andersen and its dependency on Enron, right? And it's also known in many circles as, the auditor problem, which is the auditor gets so close to the client as not actually to be capable of doing the auditing job. So my first thing is, I think it's as important as it can be to try to have a mixed portfolio of clients so that should you feel uncomfortable in one circumstance or one relationship, you can be honest. And if the honesty means that person doesn't want to work with you anymore, that's fine. And I definitely have had some clients to whom I have said, look, I am going to be very frank and open. And if you don't like it, just tell me and I'll go away. I think they like knowing they're getting the unvarnished truth from me. Or, if that isn't what they want, then we don't work together. So that's fine. So I think having not being reliant on a single client is really crucial. I think also having your running away money is really crucial. I've always believed in life, keep your overheads low so that and keep your savings as high as you can make them, so that if you're in an ethical dilemma, you can walk away. And the weird thing I found is, if you know you can walk away, you almost never have to. And I have this theory, which isn't based on a lot of fact, which is people can sense when you really do mean it. And if they know, if they sense that you are quite prepared to walk away, you never have to. I've never had to. There's just something about, no, this isn't a nervous, tentative ask. This is a hardcore negotiation. And yes, I'm prepared to walk. I think in those circumstances, you earn more respect for yourself and from your client. So I guess, that's sort of how I approach that sort of work. I think for artists, what artists mostly try to do is something very similar, which is they try to have some steady set income, which may be royalties for very successful writers. It may be teaching for some artists. It may be other aspects related to their profession. So lots of writers do copywriting, or painters may do design, that sort of thing. But generally, they're very, very practical people, and they try to have some secure income that fundamentally subsidizes their more risky or personal work. So actually, they're phenomenal. I mean, I don't think they necessarily like it, but they're extraordinarily creative in getting a lot done with often frighteningly meager resources. And we can learn a lot from them about that.
Thank you. So I'm just turning now to some more questions. So one is a comment, I think, really. Tom Bell, who said, who gets hurt? Great question. One that should resonate in the NHS and healthcare circles. So I don't think there's an answer to that, but just more of a statement. And then I have a question from Catherine Bradshaw. So she starts with, here's my imperfect question. Thank you, Margaret. Your book, Willful Blindness, had a massive impact on me. What I find interesting in your discussion about ethics and creativity is that I agree that artists work with deep empathy, connecting with people imaginatively. Do you think that the emphasis on compliance means that we lose that ethical imagination at work to make decisions?
A short answer, absolutely yes. Compliance also means if I followed all the rules, I can't be in the wrong. But we all know that, well, what about that one rule that nobody made? Or that one accident that is just about to happen, but it's never happened before, and so there's no rule about it. It's really interesting because I remember interviewing some people about the Chalcott report, which went into the bad decision-making that led up to the Iraq War. And they came up with the notion of a shortlist, which of course is well understood within healthcare circles. And I think of checklists as being kind of a form or a symbol of compliance. And they are really useful to make sure that you haven't forgotten something. But what they risk blinding you to is the something that's not on the checklist. And you see this quite a lot in the tragedy of Grenfell, where people are checking, is it on time? Is it on budget? And, that's all fine. But, and has it been passed by so-and-so? Yes. What there isn't is the question of, is so-and-so or such and such an organization actually disinterested? Is it actually capable of judging the safety of this material? How do we know? So I think there's a very tricky and delicate balance, which is why this is such a good, imperfect question, between having what is routine, which I would call compliance, and being able to step back and ask the question, if this were to go wrong, how would it go wrong? This is sometimes called a pre-mortem. And doing that at a senior level and saying, okay, so in this tower, you have these materials. You have only one fire escape because, we're being told that the alarm system is so great. What if there's a power outage and a fire?
Yeah. And I think, I think of, as I say, compliance as the rules, or as you say, routine, and and ethics as imagination. And I've said that to people who are in the compliance world, and they have reacted badly to that because I think, but it takes a lot of imagination to also create the rules. And I would agree with that. But I think there is this difference, and you do need to think about that, the difference between the two, to ensure that you're doing both. And also, I think, to say sometimes you need to, as a result of that open-minded inquiry, think about, and what are the new rules that we need in order that we don't have to go through this process again. So if we found something and it's come in out of our blind spot and into kind of our conscious awareness, then we need to kind of solve for it so that we don't risk it happening again in the future. And I think I'm very interested in the work in the future, the work of the IBE going into ethical systems and the role that ethical leaders have to shape regulations, laws, and the systems that govern us and the institutions that support our ethical infrastructure to ensure that, we're not just leaving this to uncertainty, that we can become more uncertain about certain ethical risks.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, again, if you go back to Grenfell, the fact that there had been similar fires in, recent years should have changed their thinking about that. And I think you're absolutely right that you need a much more dynamic dialogue between, if you like, compliance professionals and business professionals doing postmortems or debriefs to update the thinking about what are the discoveries that we now know we should look for as a matter of routine. In any disaster, whether it's a financial crisis or whether it's a building fire, what are the unexpected things that happen, which we could reasonably now expect to happen again? So if you're
Yes.
using the wrong cladding and there's a ton of it about, then maybe this now needs to be a routine question. We can't regard it as an anomaly. And that
Okay.
difference between, likely to happen again versus actually this is a 1 in a million chance, that's a very hard judgment call.
Mm.
But the longer you make the checklist, the less likely it is that anybody will take it seriously. So it's a really, really serious discussion to have.
Fantastic. So another question from Kathy Donaldson, who said another imperfect question. So people are picking up on this. Is there something deeper going on for us as humans in evolutionary terms that sees uncertainty as a danger or triggers a threat response when we don't have answers?
I'm not absolutely sure. I think, and it's, we don't have a measurement for uncertainty. So you can't really do the data collection on it. But I think that we have an overdeveloped sense of certainty and its availability. So for just there's a pretty simple example. If I'm going, as I'm going to later today, to take my cat to the vet, it's maybe a 15-minute drive. I have a reasonable expectation I can get there in 15 minutes. So maybe I'll leave 16 minutes before I have to. Google Maps will probably say, or GPS will probably say I can get there in 14 minutes. I absolutely know that won't be true. But all it takes is for somebody to jump the lights, or a dog to run across the street, or for a kid to run across the street, and I will not get there in 15 minutes. No way. This is uncertainty that is woven into every moment of our lives. Something could happen. So it's there all the time, but we've been persuaded by technology, wonderful technology like GPS, that no, I can get there in 14 minutes. It will be fine. Now, let me just remind you, Google Maps doesn't know that the dog's about to cross the road. I mean, I say this because actually, it sounds like a kind of weird analogy, right? But I was driving into Bath on Saturday morning, early Saturday morning, and very little traffic, going down the road. Cat runs across the road and is run over by the driver coming towards me. He sails on, I hope not realizing what he'd done. I stop the car. I get out. I pick up the cat. I put the cat in a box. I take the cat to a nearby veterinary hospital, and I catch the next train. There was uncertainty in that journey the minute I got in the car, but I didn't see it. Now, as it happens, I have lots of leeway, right, in my train journey, so that was fine. But that uncertainty is there all the time. When I go out for lunch and I buy a sandwich from Pret, there's a very high likelihood it won't make me sick, but there isn't a guarantee that it won't make me sick. Or, because I may have eaten something that it interacts badly with, or who knows, somebody in the kitchen had a bad night. So
Which is exactly
absolutely everywhere. But we have been persuaded by standardization, by technology, which depends on standardization, that we can nail down a lot, which means, I think more crucially, that our tolerance for anxiety and uncertainty, our tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty makes us super, super anxious really, really easily. And the first thing we try to do when we feel that anxiety creeping up is shut it down. And that's how we make decisions too fast. We leave margins that are too small. And because we're obsessed with efficiency, we make those margins even smaller so we can do things faster, cheaper, and bigger. And if we want more confidence, we need those margins to be bigger, not smaller. But the whole economic drive is to reduce them. And the more you reduce the margins, the less certainty you really have.
So interesting. Thank you, Margaret. Um, and I know that I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to just say this one thing and then get back to the question. One more question to just come close to closing with. But we know from our ethics at work research that, people feel pressure, systemic pressure from following bosses' orders to time pressures to the deadlines on the project coming up, or, my incentive, my bonus, my pay is related to this. And so it's this ability to develop this skill to deal with uncertainty that when ethical dilemmas are posed, to face up to the pressures that are systemic within organizations and to maintain that ethical culture, which is so clear, and why I think your book is so helpful in that regard. Okay, so another question from Sophie Badu. How do you think leaders should approach sharing uncertainty with their teams? Some leaders worry that this could make their team feel anxious, but keeping them in the dark can damage trust. How can they strike the right balance?
Yeah, that's a really, really wonderful question. I remember sitting on a board in the States, and the founder had recently died, and it was a very big personality in the business, so people were grief-stricken. And the senior leadership team was a bit lost and confused. And the business started to decline, and the board kept saying, we can't talk about this because it'll frighten the workers. And the workers were sitting there thinking, holy smoke, the business is going down the drain and the leadership team isn't talking about it. They must be in complete ignorance. This is what I call a mutually assured stalemate. You have to be able to be, I think, pretty ruthlessly honest with everybody about how the business is going. And I'll give you an example of it. The very last business I ran, I'd been invited to take over by the investors who had recently fired the CEO. We built the software for which the business had been created. We got it going. We did some amazing stuff with it. And I absolutely could not find a business model for this technology. It was super cool, but the cost of running it was prodigious and went up to a significant degree the more customers we got, which is the opposite of a business model. And I tried to see if we could do a strategic partnership. I investigated all sorts of sales, mergers, acquisitions, whatever. And I finally thought, this is just not going to work. And so I started saying to everybody in the company, this is where we are. These are the options I'm investigating. This is where we are. I remember somebody in the headquarters where my investor was based saying, Margaret's just too honest. This is really going to get her into trouble. Someone then took me aside and said, you shouldn't be so honest with your people because, you didn't grow up here, but, in America we have guns and people can be very dangerous. And I thought, this is mad. I have grown-ups working for me. I really respect them. I show my respect by telling them the truth. On the day that I had to say, we are going to close this business, the investor insisted on sending security. There wasn't a peep of difficulty. People had seen what was coming. They knew what questions to ask. They knew that they would have plenty of time to find a job working out of the office, that nobody is going to be hustled out the next day. They knew they'd get fantastic references. This is one of the most elegant exits I've ever seen in my life. And everybody did well with it. That could never have happened if I hadn't kept people up to date about where we were and also listened to them when they had ideas, because ideas can come from everywhere. And if somebody had an idea that worked, I would have taken it. So I think this paternalistic notion that you don't want to frighten the children, I think it's well-intentioned, but I think it's the wrong thing to do. And it signifies a lack of respect.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Margaret. And we're going to close very shortly. And I just want to say thank you for your time today. It's been so wonderful talking to you. The book, I listened to the book and it really does capture your imagination. It was a beautiful listen with music and interludes and stories of the creative process. It reminded me about brilliant kind of creative works that I've loved in my life, like Our Friends in the North. And it feels somewhere like between a creative work, a kind of coaching session, and a business management book. Whilst I listened to it, it kind of captured my imagination and enabled me to reflect on my own leadership journey at the IBE. So I just want to say thank you for your time today. Thank you for the book. And, you know, I have really enjoyed the conversation, and I really hope that the book has the impact on many leaders as it's had on me.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren, for that. And thank you to everybody who joined for the really wonderful and thought-provoking questions, many of which will stick in my head for quite some time to come.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margaret. Take care.
My pleasure. You too.
Bye.